Let's begin with a question. It might sound simple to you at first, but I pray you to think about it. What distinguishes a free man from a slave? For now, however, let us start this story where another one ended 3 years ago, with the death of the Lightborn. For 4,000 years they had reigned over this world, 7 arcanists who, through their magic, had acquired eternal life. In a time of chaos, they gave mankind what they thought it needed most, to be ruled over with an ironclad, fair hand. Within just 1 century, they united the shattered lands, and a single century later, their human origin was forgotten. They became gods, or Lightborn, as they let themselves be worshipped as. Yet the longer they reigned, the louder the voices grew that accused them of tyranny, the loudest being that of Naranzul Aranthi. And he succeeded in achieving what was once thought impossible. He gathered an army, overturned the Lightborn, and gave back freedom to mankind. However, the price for this was high, because where there are gaps of power, fights erupt. As such, this world grew into what it is today, shattered, riven, and broken into pieces. But all of this was merely a diversion, so that no one would notice something else. The death of the Lightborn had set something into motion, a clockwork. Having long stood still, its gears now once again slowly began to turn. This is the story of someone who wanted to be free.
In Dungeons & Dragons, the power cap that any adventurer can achieve is very straightforward. You can basically make it to level 20, which essentially transforms you into a legendary hero whose power can echo throughout an entire realm. A level 20 player character is so strong that most people will know your name. Evil villains will fear you and will attempt to hide from you, and your stories will be written down on books that scholars will read for hundreds of years. You will have the ears of kings and queens, and gods will open their gates to their realms and beckon you forth when you die. This is the epitome of what a player character can achieve. But what if you aspired for more? What if you wanted to become a god? What if you wanted to destroy a god? These are the types of questions that are not answered in any of the 5th edition books, but instead you have to go all the way back to 3rd and sometimes even 2nd edition to get some of these answers. Answers that do exist, by the way. And this is going to be the beginning of a small series of videos that I will be doing on deities. Today we will talk about how gods are made, what they need to exist, and how they can be destroyed. In our next video we will talk about how powerful can a god become, what are their abilities and resistances, and how does a godly avatar exactly work. And then in the last video of the trilogy we will talk about the single strongest god in Dungeons & Dragons, and what can that deity do that others cannot. To start off, know that gods are divided into multiple different ranks, and these ranks differentiate the level of worship that these powers possess and what is the level of strength that they have. You have greater powers, intermediate powers, lesser powers, and then demi-powers. What's particularly interesting about the way it works in Dungeons & Dragons is that these ranks are strictly defined by how many followers a deity has, but also by the fervor of each of the followers. This is very important to know because it explains how can evil gods of death and decay can have so much power, even though they don't really have massive churches and widespread support from the vast majority of people. They They possess great power because of the incredible fervor that their followers show. To top it off, these rankings can be influenced greatly, albeit temporarily, by use of powerful worship ceremonies or artifacts. So every time a paladin of Tyr, god of justice, brings justice to an evil villain, Tyr's gonna get a massive spike to its power level. But same thing applies every time a cultist sacrifices an innocent to Baal, god of murder. This is why you always see those darn cultists doing dark ceremonies and sacrificing people to their dark gods. They have to because their dark gods don't have a lot of followers, so they instead rely on strong fervor and ceremonies to keep up with the other deities. But in essence, the more followers they have and the more devout they are, the stronger the deity will be. All things being equal, a demigod typically carries around a few hundred to a few thousand followers. A lesser deity will have somewhere between a few thousand to tens of thousands. Intermediate powers will have hundreds of thousands, while greater powers will have millions of followers. Things, however, of course, are never equal. Not every follower grants the same amount of power to the deity, and when push comes to shove, not even the deities truly know the divine algorithm that goes behind all of this. To make this even more interesting, deities have very specific portfolios that define the topics, things, ideas, or emotions that the deity has power over. Talos, god of storms and destruction, has the portfolio of storms, forest fires, earthquakes, tornadoes, and general destruction. So when it comes to these things, he's particularly good at it, and when his followers do these things, Talos becomes stronger. Every god has a portfolio, and it is the duty of the god to regulate and command over its dominion. If a god were to kill another god, then the victorious deity simply takes over the portfolio and followers of the loser, of course, becoming stronger. The reason these killings don't happen as often as you would imagine, though, is because knowing that this is a possibility, many deities actually seek to form mini pantheons or groups in order to seek power in numbers. Talos, for example, leads the gods of fury, which is a collective term for destructive deities like R.E.D, who commands winter, Malor, who commands hunt, and Umberlee, who commands the sea. Talos is a great power, Umberlee is an intermediate, while both Malor and R.E.D are both lesser powers. Talos is there to protect the rest of this group, but he doesn't do it out of the kindness of his heart. He does it because all of them give Talos divine payment in the form of extra followers and sometimes in the form of a straight up divine tax, where they give him some of their divine power in exchange for safety. See, Umberlee is powerful, but if she wasn't protected, then any greater deity that would like to have the sea in their portfolio could go on and try to take her out, and most likely succeed. It is a god-eat-god world out there, and everyone wants to become a greater deity, and they will do whatever it takes to get there. And that's because the difference between a greater power and an intermediate power is actually huge. For one, typically a deity can only be killed by a power that is of the same level or higher. Umberlee, for example, could never kill Talos. If she tried, Talos would literally just reappear. There is a major power discrepancy, yeah, and I mean major, but it is more about there being a straight up divine law about this. If a deity of lower rank tries to kill one of higher rank, the higher rank deity will simply just spawn back again. This applies to all ranks except for demigod, of course, which are the lowest. Deities can also only be permanently killed whilst in their own domain, but it is also there where they are at their strongest. Their magics tend to be maximized while in their own personal plane, and most deities also possess a plethora of divine guardians and monsters that protect them from attack. That being said, the power discrepancy between a higher rank god and any particular deity is so big that it typically only takes a lot of time for preparation and a willingness to spend a lot of resources for that higher rank deity to kill one of lower rank, provided that the lower rank god, of course, does not possess outside help. Whereas when it comes to two gods of the same rank duking it out, the winner would require assistance from other powers, a lot of high-powered mortals, especially designed ceremonies and spells, artifacts, or all of the above in order to win. It is not impossible, however, for some of these divine protections to be circumvented, but they would be the exception to the rule. For example, a couple of videos ago we talked about the Jathaman Dagger, a magical artifact whose power allowed for the slaying of gods. Its special property being the ability to remove divine protections and manipulating the fate of divine beings. With this dagger, you could theoretically fully kill a god, even as a mortal, something that you of course normally cannot do. So far we have talked mostly about gods fighting gods, but what about mortals fighting gods? Frankly, it is described to us in the lore that there's just plain isn't a way for a mortal to truly fight a deity of lesser rank and above. The disparity in power is just unreal. We are never given a blanket challenge rating for a god, but based on the lore, we can figure out that the overall average fighting level of a god, without any divine properties or protections, range between CR 40 to CR 60. We know this because there is a CR 56 titan that can slay any god one-on-one. It's not just that he can, but he actually did kill dozens of gods. If you're interested in hearing about that, I would recommend you check out my video on the single strongest monster of all time. Now the problem though is that it's not just that you would have to deal with a possibly CR 40 or CR 50 creature, but the divine protections and divine abilities that come with being a divine. Divine abilities that are mostly there to deal with mortals, which is the greatest strength that a god has. Gods can basically do almost anything that they want to mortals if they are higher rank enough. Some of them can literally just kill you by thinking about killing you. We're actually going to talk about these specific divine powers granted to each of the ranks in our next video. Alas, the only type of power that mortals have any chance of challenging are demi-powers. Not just because they are the weaker deities, but because most demi-powers have their domains in the prime material plane instead of the outer planes. This makes them not just easier to access by mortals, but if the mortals had a particular way to kill the deity, like the Deathman dagger, then killing the deity would be permanent since, again, you can only permanently kill them in their home plane. There are also other reasons, most of which I hope to talk about on the next video, but to give you a taste, demi-powers need to use spells or items to teleport, unlike the rest of the deities, which can just innately do so, which means you can counterspell demi-powers and prevent them from running. Demi-powers can also only summon a single avatar per year, which means you only have to deal with one avatar before you can challenge the real boss. Other deities can summon dozens, if not hundreds, depending on the rank, which makes them hilariously impossible to defeat. Now, the last way in which a god can die is through neglect. Quote, "Deities need the power provided them by worship to exist. One way for a power to die is for it to have no more worshippers. To intentionally cause a power's death through this method is difficult even for most greater powers. Basically, all the worshippers of a deity have to die, or the power has to gradually lose worshippers so slowly that it does not realize its inevitable fate until it can do little to stop it. Powers can hang on as demi-powers as long as they have even one worshipper, and even after they lose that worshipper, it takes them a while to wither away while they wring the last bits of deific sustenance from the use of their name, their sovereignty over the principles and ideals of their portfolio, and even the awe inspired by tales about them as myth or parables. During this time, they would make every effort to get anyone to worship them. To effectively ensure the death of such a deity at that point, in all likelihood, it would have to be imprisoned on its home plane and rendered unable to communicate with any mortal being. Eventually then, he would die." End quote. Now, when a power actually dies, it is magically transported to the astral plane for it to float for all eternity. This is why when you travel in the astral plane, you do see a lot of these enormous corpses of incredible creatures just floating petrified. Quote, "The power itself drifts helplessly in the silver void of the astral, occasionally stirring as if in slumber, but never reawakening." End quote. See, a deity is never truly dead, even in death. Just how a mortal can be resurrected, technically so can a god, but it is of course much more convoluted and complicated for a deity to be able to come back. Quote, "In order to live again as a deity, a power must be worshipped and cannot have been utterly destroyed. Then something must be done to suddenly and massively direct a great deal of worship power into the deity. This involves a prolonged ritual in which the dead power's name is repeatedly invoked. Often massive quantities of offerings of the type most favored by the power are also made, and sometimes artifacts are used to somehow direct the power generated by the ceremony more efficiently into the deity." End quote. Any resurrected deity brought back in this fashion always comes back as a demi-power, and then it is up to the power to accumulate enough power to bring itself back up to whatever power it used to have. Typically, they also only receive the bare essentials of the portfolios they used to have, having more than likely lost many of their domains in death. Now, I don't have to tell you, of course, that if a deity is dead, priests and paladins or druids that got spells from it will no longer get it. Also, even though a dead deity is never truly dead, it is effectively dead in the sense that it cannot feel anything, it cannot sense anything or do anything. Vestiges are something very different, which we might talk about at some other point. The only thing a dead god can actually ever sense is, quote, the speaking of its name during a ceremony to attempt to restore it to life. End quote. Silently, ponderously, they float through the astral plane, mammoth isles of rock adrift in an endless sea of silver. Once they were gods, now they are little more than debris, petrified husks of fading belief and forgotten prayer. Yet for many, their memories linger, their dreams live on, and for some, those dreams are terrifying nightmares of vengeance and conquest and death. Oof, I was about to end the video, I almost forgot. So how can a hero become a god? As you can imagine, most direct ways are not told to us in the lore, but we're actually given the bare minimum of what is required in order to be able to achieve it. Usually the process involves a combination of things: the accumulation of power, the use of arcane rituals, the use of artifacts, the sponsorship of an already established power, or some combination of these. In raw game terms, quote, in order to even attempt to ascend into godhood, a mortal in the Forgotten Realms setting should have achieved at least level 25, have one attribute score of 25 or above, and have another attribute score of at least 19. She or he must then spend a great deal of time researching methods to attain divinity, come up with a plan for doing so, and confront great peril in order to execute that plan. The plan must always involve at least two of these three things: the performance of a specially researched ceremony or spell of elaborate complexity, great cost, and great personal danger, the use of an artifact, or the sponsorship of a deity. End quote. When all of this is done, then it all comes down to whether or not Ao, the Overlord, accepts your entry into divinity. Ao is the god of gods. He is the hidden one, the divine that makes all the decisions in the background. He is, of course, the subject of the third video on this series, but know that he and he alone gets to decide who becomes a god, and he alone has the power to remove that power from you at his command. Quote, often in attempts to attain divine status through power rituals or the use of artifacts, failure, in the form of a tacit no from Ao, results in the mortal becoming a lich, being transformed into some other odd form of undead creature, or being totally destroyed. Usually, if a divine power is involved in some form of sponsorship of a candidate before Ao, a rejection means that the mortal either continues on in life, hoping to overcome whatever the cause of Ao's rejection was and to be given a second chance, or passes on into the afterlife to become a powerful servant of the sponsoring deity in the outer planes. Ao is never obliged to explain his decisions. End quote. Deities in Dungeons & Dragons do not have stats. They have never been given stats, and that's because, according to the lore, the power of deities is, quote, impossible to quantify. Statistics quite simply become meaningless when dealing with the powers of the realm, end quote. Now, that doesn't mean that we lack deific abilities and properties. We got them. Even though we cannot tell you exactly how much a god will do to you with a sword strike, we can tell you how your character sheet will change if we were to add divine to your monster type. First and foremost, of course, the power of a deity drastically changes depending on the rank of the deity. And as far as ranks are concerned, we have 4. We have greater gods, intermediate gods, lesser gods, and demigods. And just how we described it before, your rank is signified mostly by the amount of followers that you have, how devout they are, and how many ceremonies those followers perform for you. Elevating yourself to a higher rank is what most gods aspire to do, mostly because of all of the incredible abilities that you obtain as you rank up. You also become much more harder to kill by other gods when you are higher ranked, and as you can imagine, you can provide a bigger plane for yourself to call home the higher you are in the hierarchy. First of all, let's cover the abilities that every single deity has just by the nature of being divine. These are the abilities and attributes that they all share. First of all, every single god has a portfolio. These are the topics, things, ideas, or emotions that a god has dominion, power, and control over. This is automatically given to you the second that you become a deity. You will of course get a portfolio that corresponds to your personality and desires, but mostly it depends entirely on the overlord. What he gives you is what you get. Many gods actually kill each other to obtain better and more far-encompassing portfolios, something that actually does transfer to the victor of a godly duel. This transfer, however, will only happen if the portfolio actually matches with the victor, as in, the victor must have the moral capabilities of ruling and enacting the new portfolios that would be given to him. If the god of death kills the god of life, the god of death needs to be able to promote life as much as it promotes death, otherwise the portfolio of life will pass on to the next closest higher ranked god of life. It is also crucial to note that there can only ever be one single highly ranked god of a particular domain. You can't have two higher ranked gods of death. You can have a god of death and a god of decay, or a god of the sun and a god of the dawn, but you can't have two high ranked gods of the sun. I say higher ranked because this rule does not apply with demigods. You can have as many demigods of as many portfolios as you like, but if there are gods that share portfolios, only one of them can ever go above demigod status. Whether or not this rule is strictly applied in the canon is hard to say because gods shift portfolios all the time, especially through the editions. The lore states that anything can make a god change portfolios, from dying and being resurrected to ascending or dropping in divine status to even having massive personality shifts. Now, all gods are, of course, immortal. They do not need sustenance other than prayer and simply do not age. Furthermore, they cannot be fully killed. If injured to the point of death, the deity will simply reform its shape in a matter of days. The only way to permanently kill a deity is for a divine of higher rank to do the destroying. And even then, the body of the deity will be sent to float for all eternity in the astral plane, a body which can be revived in the future if very specific powerful rituals are made. The only way to permanently kill a god would be to then completely evaporate or destroy the floating deific carcass in the astral plane. Now, when it comes to abilities, all deities possess the innate ability to instantly teleport to any point they desire in the same plane that they are in. They can do this at will. Deities also always go first in the initiative. This is just a rule. They may choose not to do anything in their turn if they want to, but otherwise they always go first. All deities have the divine ability to understand and speak any language that exists, including those languages that require special attributes like pheromones or specific body parts. Furthermore, quote, all powers can speak directly and secretly to any being across any void and through any physical or mystical barrier. This power transcends the bounds of space and planes, but not time, end quote. It is also implied that the only reason that gods cannot transcend time is because it is a divine rule, a rule that could be broken if the overlord would allow it. All deities have the ability to cast any spell from any level from the priest or wizard class, and does not require any form of component or special requirement, including the use of spellbooks or hand gestures or voice activation. Quote, invoking such powers requires the slightest act of will on the part of these incredible beings. End quote. I should also mention that deities can cast 2 spells in a single round, or they can opt to do their full melee action plus a spell. Many gods also invent or change the way spells work since they have such facility with magic. All deities also obtain divine immunities to certain types of damage. Your weapon must be at least a +1 magical weapon to hurt a demigod or a lesser god. It must be a +2 weapon to hurt an intermediate god or a +3 weapon to hurt a greater deity. Furthermore, quote, all powers are immune to any sort of magic that would automatically kill them if they fail a saving throw, that would instantly kill them with no saving throw, that would disintegrate them, or that would drain energy or life levels. They are also immune to the powers of all glyphs and symbols which do nothing to them except attract their attention. They are also immune to psionic abilities not practiced by a divine being, and even then, they are immune to psionic abilities used by deities of lower rank than themselves." End quote. And last but not least, they all have the power of granting any abilities or spells of any level to their priests that does not exceed their own capabilities. Now, these special properties that I just mentioned is just what everyone gets, but like I described it before, the higher rank that you are, the more abilities and powers that you get. So some of what we're about to describe now will vary tremendously depending on which rank we're talking about. Gods get the special ability to shapeshift in that they can turn themselves into other things. A demigod can only change into an animate object that is appropriate to their portfolio, and that form has to be an average example of the creature. If Loru, demigod of unicorns, wants to turn herself into a unicorn, she cannot be a special unicorn, just a normal unicorn of normal size. That being said, you will sometimes see special effects related to the deity doing the transformation. The unicorn might have glowing white eyes or might have different markings in her fur, for example. Lesser gods are a bit stronger in that they don't require to pick an animate object that is related to their portfolio. They can be whatever they want. They are, however, still restricted to being an average example of that which they're trying to imitate. Intermediate deities see a big spike in power as they typically do, for they can shapeshift not just into any animate object, but also inanimate. The only restriction is that the shape that they assume cannot be bigger than the biggest one already currently in existence. It doesn't matter if the biggest one is enchanted or natural, you just cannot be bigger than that one. The reason I say this is a big jump in power is because being able to take on inanimate objects allows these deities to assume the shape of big mountains or rivers, like you might have heard in some mythologies. Lastly, we have the epitome of power, which are the greater deities. They have absolutely no restriction on their transformations. In fact, beings of this stature have been known to assume planetary proportions. Next, we have the godly ability of planar travel. For this one, greater gods, intermediate gods, and lesser gods all share the same properties. They can, at will, simply travel from plane to plane without any chance of error and without requiring any form of component. Furthermore, this travel cannot be hindered by any physical or material barrier. The only ones who don't possess this ability are the demigods, who simply must travel using their very own methods, whether by using mortal means like magic, or by using mundane special pathways like portals, or by asking superior deities for summons. The one advantage, though, that demigods get over other deities in this way is that they can actually enter the prime material realm. Greater, intermediate, and lesser gods cannot ever enter the prime material plane. Let me repeat that. Any deity other than demigod cannot enter the prime material plane. It is strictly forbidden. The only way that they can do it is through avatars. Now, I know that this is one that you guys will be interested to hear about. The one ability that allows gods to be able to see what is going on in the prime material world. The one ability that allows for a god to be able to sense or see you when you pray to it. Deities can sense anything, not just around themselves, but around any one of their followers and around any one of their holy objects. You as a cleric don't have to do anything. Just by following your god, you're allowing your god to be able to see you and sense around you. Furthermore, even if you're not a follower of a specific god, just by mentioning the name of that god, you're opening the ability for that god to be able to see you and sense around you. This is why you always need to be very careful not to go around saying the names of evil deities. It'll move their gazes towards you, and more importantly, they will be able to see everything that you do. Now, of course, these powers are made grander the higher in the ranks that you are as a deity. A demigod can only see up to a mile around where it can sense, whether that is around its own body, or whether it is around its followers and holy objects, or a person that has ushered its name. A lesser god does this to up to 10 miles around. An intermediate god can do this up to 100 miles around, and a greater god can do this for the entire plane. As long as a greater god has a single follower in any plane of existence, he can sense anything, anywhere on that plane. Now, when it comes to a person that has ushered the name of the god, a demigod can sense around where its name was ushered for up to an hour. A lesser god can do that for a day, an intermediate god for a month, and a greater god for a full year. Now, it is very important to know that all of these sensing powers can be blocked by the conscious effort of a deity of similar rank or the unconscious desires of those of greater stature. It is very unlikely that your god will be able to, for example, tell you everything that you need to know about the evil villain's lair if that villain follows a powerful evil deity. That is because the evil deity will prevent your god's sensing powers. This is also why it always behooves you to follow strong deities, because they have the power to prevent other evil forces from being able to always sense you. This is also why greater deities are considered to be basically omniscient, since it is extremely rare for their senses to be muffled in any capacity, and they also have the ability to block most deities from seeing something that they don't want seen. Many intermediate and lesser deities actually seek the help of greater deities in their pantheons to help them protect and block sight of their secrets and magical artifacts. Furthermore, greater deities have such power in this regard and such freedoms in their senses that they can, quote, accurately predict the precise actions of mortals and other deities based on their vast knowledge, end quote. Greater deities are very, very scary when they are not on your side. Gods also have the power of creation, the ability to produce things from nothing. Or I should say, some gods have this ability. Greater gods can literally produce anything that they can think of, whether that would be diamonds or gold or elephants or humans. They just wish it into existence and then they exist. The process, however, is very draining for them since they're using their very own energy stores and turning it into physical objects. For every tonnage of mass that they produce, they must rest for a round. Intermediate powers cannot create things out of nothing like greater powers can. Instead, what they can do is either summon a duplicate of something that they're holding, if it exists in the same plane, or simply create a duplicate of that which they're holding, if the materials exist within the plane to produce it. This process, however, is also tiring for the god and must rest for a round for every 100 pounds that they produce in this manner. Now, lesser powers, on the other hand, cannot create or duplicate any object. Instead, they instinctively know where to find the object that they desire if it exists. If the item does not exist, they know the location of someone who can create it or manufacture it. Demigods are even weaker in this, for they do not instinctively know where to find things. Instead, they have to manually search the multiverse using their own senses or followers in order to find what they're looking for. This is yet another example of how massively overpowered greater powers are when compared to the rest. There's always that massive power spike in between intermediate and greater powers. Gods have powers over life and death. When it comes to the ability to give life, lesser, intermediate, and greater powers all have the ability to simply resurrect a dead mortal back to life, regardless of where that mortal is and regardless of the current status of its body. Demigods, on the other hand, must be either present with the dead body or must have an extension of themselves by the dead body, whether that would be an avatar or a holy relic. The power over death, however, is a tad more exclusive to those on the higher echelons of divinity. Greater powers can literally kill anyone they wish, regardless of who it is and regardless of where he or she is located. All the greater power has to do is merely think of it, and the living mortal will perish. Of course, any other greater god can reverse this effect immediately if so desired. Now, interestingly enough, even though intermediate gods cannot kill whoever they want, they instead have the special ability to produce something similar. See, intermediate gods cannot kill a person directly, that's just divine law. Instead, they can do so indirectly. They, quote, have the ability to arrange accidents that can kill any mortal being anywhere, end quote. That's all the description that we get, so take whatever you want from that. Now, a big question that I know many of you are probably asking yourselves right now is, how can these gods do all of this at the same time? I mentioned before that a god can have multiple avatars at the same time. Any particular god can also sense hundreds, if not millions of followers in different realms of existence. Well, another special power that deities get is the ability to multitask. It sounds a bit silly, but the higher rank that you are, the more that you can deal with at the same time. A demigod can only perform up to 2 tasks at once without any kind of penalty. This means that a demigod might be able to talk to 2 different people at once, or might be able to use an avatar and fight an adventurer while simultaneously creating a magical item in its real form without any penalties. Lesser powers can perform up to 5 tasks at once without any penalties. Intermediate deities can do up to 100 tasks, while greater gods have absolutely no limit to how many things they can do at once. You could theoretically have a greater god give a personalized speech to each person on the planet, each person receiving a different paragraph, while simultaneously have that same god control all of his avatars and have them battle each a different group of adventurers in multiple different planes of existence, while also formulating a conniving master plan to dismantle the world order. They can do as many things as they want. The only thing to keep in mind though is that physical bodies will still retain the limits of their form, so if a greater god has an avatar that exists in the shape of a human, that human still only has 2 arms and can only do things confined to the laws of physics. And then lastly, we have avatars. Quote, "When powers have vital business in the prime material plane, they must send avatars to act for them. An avatar is simply a manifestation of a deity upon the prime material plane. This manifestation is not nearly as powerful as a power and is merely a projection of a deity's power onto the prime material plane. An almost infinitely vast gulf of power lies between the god and the avatar. The avatar embodies just a small portion of the god's power. However, avatars share many of the abilities of powers. They have the same teleportation abilities, initiative advantage, communication abilities, and immunities as all deities do. Unlike a power, an avatar can be destroyed. This is never looked upon kindly by the true god and often results in divine retribution. Although avatars may take many different forms, the number that can be created and frequency with which they may be replaced depends upon a power's stature." End quote. A demigod can only create a single avatar at a time, and it takes them an entire full year to create another if that one is destroyed. It is not impossible to find demigods too that can't even fashion a single avatar. Now, lesser powers can have 2 avatars at a time, and if one is destroyed, it'll take the god about a month to make another. Intermediate gods can have up to 5 avatars, and it takes them 7 days to make another. Lastly, greater powers can have up to 10, but it only takes them a single day to recreate one. Now, one really interesting tidbit about avatars that I personally found cool is that a god can actually use the avatar of a deity that they have subsumed. So if my level 20 character somehow managed to kill Alduin, demigod of Draconic Afterlife, and I further became a deity for it, I could not just produce my own avatar with my own abilities and personality, but I could also take on whatever avatar Alduin had designed for itself. There are some restrictions, however. If I choose to use Alduin's avatar in this example, I would not be able to use any of my own abilities while in that form. I would only be able to use Alduin's abilities, and I would have to somewhat behave like Alduin. Quote, "When a power uses a puppet avatar to appear as another deity, the avatar must behave in all of its abilities, though not necessarily its intent and mentality, as if it were really that of the deity being imitated. In addition, a power's normal avatar form cannot use the abilities of a subsumed deity avatar itself. Avatars must act with the capabilities that they were originally formed to use." End quote. If you want to combine the abilities you possess with the abilities of Alduin in this example, you can, but you would have to combine your avatar with that of Alduin and create something entirely new. This new form has to be different enough that the changes are obvious to both your worshippers and Alduin's worshippers. Now, to finish off the video, let's talk a bit about resistances and protections. Divinity, by virtue of being divine, are given great protections not just against mortals, but against themselves. When it comes to magical damage coming from mortal sources like adventurers, demigods only take about 30% of the damage. They are extremely resistant, and this resistance only gets worse as we go up the ranks. Lesser powers only take 10% of the damage from mortal magic. Intermediate gods only take 5%, while greater powers are completely immune to any damaging magic that you will throw at them. Furthermore, the only way a demigod can lose a saving throw is if it rolls a natural 3 or lower, and only if that roll still doesn't pass the saving throw, of course. In essence, if a demigod fails a saving throw, it only really fails it if the roll was a natural 3 or lower. Same thing applies to lesser powers, except that they only fail on a natural 1 or a natural 2, while intermediate powers will only fail if their natural 1 still does not pass the check. Quote, all greater powers are assumed to automatically make all saving throws required of them. This is a reflection of their great abilities, mental powers, and physical stamina. End quote. Tyr is the god of justice, a domain so powerful that he is a greater god by only having justice in his portfolio. In our last video, we talked about how powerful a greater god is, how there is literally no end to their might, yet as powerful as Tyr is, with one mere thought, his eyes were gouged out by the overgod. There was nothing that Tyr could have done to defend himself. Tyr spoke out of turn and was punished for it. This is the power of an overgod, a god beyond gods. In Dungeons & Dragons, an overpower or an overgod is a deity that exists above deities, one that exists even farther than the normal bounds of the divine. Their power is so great that even the word deity falls short in measuring their enormity. There are a few entities in the Forgotten Realms that many could define as overgods. Mastika from the Mastican Pantheon, the Celestial Emperor from the Celestial Bureaucracy in Karatur, or even the Principle of Fate that guides the Sakaran Pantheon. These entities have complete authority over the pantheons that they watch over, in a sense kind of like how Corellon Lorethian rules over the Elvish Pantheon. But these powers, as strong as they are, and they are strong, they fall short to that which is the topic of this video. The overgod of all of Toril, in fact of all of realm space. His name is Ao, and he rules over all gods. The reality of it is that we do not know the full extent of its powers. He cannot see into the future, he cannot or will not read into the minds of gods, he does not appear to be fully omniscient, in the least it appears that gods can do things behind his back or at least hide things from him, but what he can do is incredible. In the book Unhallowed Ground, we were told that Ao has the portfolio of deities and balance, but it truly goes way beyond that. In the Forgotten Realms campaign guide for 4th edition, we were told that Ao created the crystal sphere that contains the world of the Forgotten Realms and all the other planets of its solar system. Through the book Fates and Avatars, we discovered that he then created and allowed entities to enter the crystal sphere and populate the planet. He elevated some to godhood in order to balance power all around and then simply left them to their own devices. During the next period in time, gods could do whatever they wanted. They killed each other, they reproduced with one another, and they raised any mortal they wanted into godhood. Quote, they were unchecked in their proliferation and self-destruction, end quote. This lively state of existence allowed for the war between the gods and the primordials, entirely different beings that each wanted the planet for themselves. This war almost destroyed the planet Toril, the main and most important planet in the solar system, and as such, Ao decided to simply split the planet in half. One planet would go to the gods, and then one planet would go to the primordials. The planets didn't exist in the same physical reality, but exist simultaneously in different prime realms. This was the first time that Ao showed himself in the lore. Before then, he had merely just existed in the background of things. This was about 32,000 years ago as to the present day, but even after this, he would stay in the background until just recently in the story, until basically just about 150 years ago to the present day, in the beginning of what we call the Time of Troubles. For these last 32,000 years, the gods were allowed to basically just do, again, whatever they wanted. We're not really sure the full extent of the rules that they had to follow, but we do know that they did have a few rules. For example, Ao forbade two gods from ever having identical portfolios, and also stated that if two gods ever clashed with one another, then only one of three things could ever happen. One of the gods would have to fade from the realms, both gods would have to merge, or one or both gods would have to alter their portfolios sufficiently so that both could then remain. These rules essentially made it so that gods constantly fought each other for supremacy, something that created a lot of instability for these 30,000 years. See, during the separation of the planet for both the primordials and the gods, Ao created the fabled Tablets of Fate. The Tablets of Fate were a very powerful set of artifacts that kept the planets separated, but furthermore, it also denoted the responsibilities and powers that each god and each primordial was supposed to have. Theoretically speaking, if you were to read it, you would see each god written on it alongside the responsibilities that they were supposed to uphold. In essence, the tablets were a physical representation of the gods' duties. But then about 30,000 years later, Bane, god of tyranny, ambition, and control, alongside Merkel, god of death and decay, stole the Tablets of Fate, thinking that a modicum of Ao's power resided within it, power that they wanted for themselves. This was the last straw that broke the camel's back, the single event that showed Ao that gods could not be allowed anymore to run rampant without any checks, the event that told Ao that gods didn't respect the power that had been bestowed upon them, and that they would not be able to use it responsibly, and so he banished every single god from the heavens and forced them to walk the prime material realm in mortal form in order to both teach them humility, force them to get closer to their worshippers, and of course to find the stolen Tablets of Fate. To keep the story short, the tablets were eventually found and Ao destroyed them in front of everyone. He said, quote, "The tablets mean nothing," Ao said to the gods, "because the gods had made a mockery of their meaning. I kept them to remind you that I created gods to serve the balance, not to twist it to your own ends. But this point was lost on you. You saw the tablets as a set of rules by which to play juvenile games of prestige and pomp. Then when the rules became inconvenient, you stole them." End quote. Since the gods cared nothing for the balance they were supposed to serve, Ao destroyed the tablets. However, the tablets also kept the two planets apart. Quote, "If the gods were determined to live in strife and upheaval, then they might as well fight the primordials again." End quote. During this time, the lands of the two planets started slowly converging, migrating from one reality to the other. It is in fact around this time when the Dragonborn appeared on the planet. If you didn't know, the Dragonborn were actually from the planet dominated by the primordials, but during this convergence of planes, one of their capital cities was taken and replanted into Toril, and this is why we have Dragonborn in 5th edition, and why we don't really have them on previous editions. It is a new thing that just happened. Because the Tablets of Fate were destroyed, which were also holding the names of each god and their portfolios, gods could now move portfolios much easier, which created further turmoil in the divine ranks, and which fomented gods into reaching for more and more power by either killing each other or plotting in other ways. This got even worse when Mystra, goddess of magic, was murdered, which of course created the Spell Plague. All in all, things were just getting worse. Realizing that walking amongst mortals did not stop the gods from their juvenile bickering and infighting, coming to terms that they were not going to change, Ao instead decided to simply force their hand and change the entire way divinity works in order to force them to care about their worshippers. Essentially, Ao decided that he was going to take a more active role in managing the heavens, that from now on he was going to decide who was going going to be God, and he would start actively switching portfolios around if he deemed it necessary. If you were not doing your part in progressing and balancing your portfolio, AO might just simply take it away from you now. Furthermore, gods could no longer turn mortals into gods. Instead, they would have to petition AO for him to allow it. This would include now mortals like Karsus, who during their lives had obtained so much power that they could just turn themselves into gods. Well, that just wouldn't be allowed anymore starting from this point forward. At least not without the approval of AO. If you use arcane power to turn yourself into a god and then AO simply said no, you would instead now turn into a lich or a similar undead creature. AO also started demoting and promoting whoever he deemed proper for the role. If you were not doing your job, you simply wouldn't get to be a god anymore. He also decided whether or not a god could be resurrected or not. Overall, AO took a hands-on approach. He then remade a new set of tablets of fate with rewritten gods and portfolios, and with these new tablets, the two planets would be once again separated and a new set of rules would be enacted. These new tablets of fate, which marked the end of the time of troubles, were created in 1482 DR. That is only 7 years before the events of Horde of the Dragon Queen, which is set in 1489 DR, and marks the beginning, of course, of the 5th edition storyline. So it doesn't really matter which adventure you're playing in 5th edition, Tyranny of Dragons, Out of the Abyss, Princess of the Apocalypse, Dragon Heist, or Descent into Avernus, this change is basically as new as it can be. For further context, 3rd edition Forgotten Realms was basically during the time of troubles, when everything was going wild. If you played adventures during 3rd edition in the Forgotten Realms, you basically lived through those days of insanity. 5th edition is now after things have comparatively calmed down. What's interesting, however, was that nobody knew what was going to happen when the new tablets of fate were being created. Quite frankly, the gods were scared. AO had made it very clear that he was unhappy with the way things had been going, that he was disappointed in the actions of many gods. Some thought that many gods would be deleted, killed, and replaced. Many thought that the world was going to end. AO had warned the gods to gather as many followers as they could before the stones were complete, but he didn't specify the reason. There was genuine fear in the pantheons of heaven and hell. Many gods gathered as many followers as they could so that when the world would end, they would find themselves on the right heaven. They thought that they needed to save as many souls as possible from the rapture. The spell plague looked like it was going to ravage the whole world without any end in sight, and so maybe the only solution was to just remake the world, or to simply get it over with and destroy it once and for all. You have to understand that nobody knows whatever AO is ever thinking. He has no alignment. He doesn't communicate with the gods. He doesn't have any motives other than balance and equilibrium. He might have just destroyed the world and all the gods with it, for all you know. But he didn't. Some gods were demoted, others promoted. Portfolios shifted and new rules were added, but things sort of just went back to normal. I say normal, but things are already going out of control again. The rise of Tiamat, an invasion of demons and devils. Uptau's ancient pact is broken and he can no longer protect the peaks of flame from Dendar the Night Serpent. Anam the All-Father finally gave up on his giants. I mean, things are bad and it's only been like 10 years. But I digress. During the entirety of the lore of the Forgotten Realms in Dungeons & Dragons, AO has really only made an appearance to do something about 3 times. Once during the battle between the gods and the primordials in order to separate the planets, once during the time of troubles to punish the gods for letting the tablets of fate be stolen, and then last during the recreation of the tablets directly before the beginning of 5th edition. Outside of these 3 events, we literally know nothing of this entity. We don't know where he exists or what his purpose is other than to balance things. We know that he doesn't answer any prayers. We've actually had cultists of Ao in Waterdeep since the time of Troubles, but they all eventually dispersed, since they weren't getting any cleric spells out of it, which is hilarious. We know that he has no interest in communicating with mortals or showing himself to us. We know this since he only showed himself over just so that he could castigate the gods. We also know that he still hasn't shown himself into any of the other continents. We know that he has great power over all gods, like the ability to raise any person into godhood or remove any god he wants and take their powers. But he also has other abilities, like the ability to shape and destroy worlds. We know this since he literally created the crystal sphere of realm space and then he split the planet in two thousands of years later. We know that he can directly overpower and harm even greater deities since he gouged Tyr, god of justice, for speaking out against them during the time of troubles. And lastly, we know that he does have a superior, an entity called the Luminous Being, which is said to be the creator of all the galaxies and universes, but many surmise that the Luminous Being is just a metaphor for the Game Master. We also know that Ao shows as a male since he showed himself once during the time of troubles. He appeared as a massive floating flowing beard with a nondescript face. It's interesting that it wasn't described as a floating face with a beard, but instead it was described as a beard with a face attached to it. And this is the only official art that we actually have about Ao. Across the lore, all we really get about him are tiny paragraphs spread across many different lore books. We got this paragraph in Unhallowed Ground. We know that Ao took Tyr's eyes because of Sword Coast Adventures Guide. We got this paragraph of info from Forgotten Realms Campaign Guide of 3rd edition. We get a bit about the creation of the world in Forgotten Realms Campaign Guide 4th edition that barely mentions Ao by name. Polyhedron number 94 mentions the cult of Ao but doesn't really say anything about the entity itself. Most of the info that we have actually comes from fates and avatars, which does speak a lot about the powers that Ao possesses, all of which we have already covered. Like the fact that now everything has to go through him, like who becomes a god and such. And then lastly, of course, are the novels and the backdrop of info from the settings, like the events that unfolded in the time of troubles and the spell plague, which does mention Ao and some of his decisions. When it comes to mortals themselves, it was revealed to us that basically the only person that could know anything about Ao would be Elminster, as in, he knew who Ao was before the time of troubles even took place. So it is likely that he would know more, but it is unlikely he would ever say anything, so we're left with really not much, to be honest. Just keep in mind though that Ao only has power over realm space, over the Forgotten Realms. His power does not reach and cannot manipulate anything beyond this crystal sphere. When he forced all the gods into mortal forms during the time of troubles, it was revealed that he could only manifest the power that gods had in this crystal sphere. To explain that better, the Norse and Egyptian pantheon, for example, are what we call multi-sphere powers. They have followers in the Forgotten Realms, but they also have followers in other crystal spheres. Ao could only manifest and control the Forgotten Realms sides during that event. If Ao killed them in the Forgotten Realms, then they would still exist in the other crystal spheres. They merely could not reform or produce any impact on realm space. It doesn't matter how powerful Ao is, he would not be able to make any difference or impact on Everon or Greyhawk or any of the Magic the Gathering worlds. But that's it. That is what we have on the greatest god in the world.
Target on my back, lone survivor last. They got me in the sights. No surrender, no trigger, fingers go. Living the dangerous life. Hey, 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 every day when I wake, I'm trying to get up, they're knocking me down.
Chewing me up, spitting me out.
Hey, 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 when I need to be saved, you're making me strong, you're making me stand.
Never will fall, never will hurt.
Shot like a rocket up into the sky, nothing can stop me tonight. You make me feel invincible, earthquake powerful, just like a tidal wave. You make me brave, young guy, titanium fight song, raise it up like the roar of victory in a stadium.
This is Dan Winter again, fractalfield.com, therify.net. Thank you for all the invitations to share and all the interest worldwide. We have probably 15, 20,000 now in our Facebook and also the same in YouTube, and we appreciate all the interest. And therify.net, our plasma tech, is in over 25 countries, and things are going well for us. The advanced research, carbon nano, and many other things are cooking, and there's lots of excitement. Today's conversation is a bit esoteric. It's entitled The Physics and Science of Transcendence, the Rapture, what it means to go into 5D, and the difference between sphere and hypersphere, and understanding grid dynamics a little bit in terms of portals and plasma projection. And this conversation will be in the context of extraterrestrial politics. Now, I know some people think conversing about extraterrestrial politics is too controversial, but I firmly believe that within 1 to 2 years from now, when the treaty allows all the ETs to announce their presence, that all those who have not discussed extraterrestrial politics will begin to feel embarrassed. But first, let's start with something simple. So Teresa Burns, very kindly co-leading our wonderful Facebook discussion group on Ophanim Enochian, politely today asked, Dear Dan Winter, if it may take a moment of your time, would you mind talking to us a little bit here about spheres versus hyperspheres? The way you approach them is a bit different from the approach of many people. You also prefer other shapes to spheres. Could you take a moment and explain why that is? In bioenergetics particularly, you seem to steer people away from spheres. Why? That's a good, very simple, it's a question like, how do you get to the next dimension? Well, you emerge from a sphere. Well, let's start that conversation in terms of something we've talked about many times before, in terms of the study of cancer. Actually, let's see if I can find this. Yes, okay. So here is our little conversation about cancer. That we know, for example, that medical doctors, let me bring my face up here again so you can see me, that medical doctors know the difference between a cancer cell and a cell that's not cancer. One of the primary indicators is when it's cancer, the cell will be more spherical. If the cell is much less spherical, lots of bumpy egg-shaped plasma projective, then it's not cancer. And the simplistic but correct one way to look at that is simple. Cancer is the energy stuck inside the membrane, and a membrane which is spherical is the opposite of plasma projective. It's containment versus distribution. Now, containment is not always evil, but obviously cancer is the opposite of charge distribution efficiency. In other words, the cancer cell has gone asocial. It's gathered all its charge inside, and it's not distributing well. The physics of that is the membrane is too hard, and it doesn't respond to touch. And that contact inhibition, the ability to inhibit replication based on whether it is touched, is the definition of cancer. And it's very metaphoric and useful to see about how when people are touched, if they respond to touch, they're less likely to get cancer. Well, that's true of their cells too. Now, that conversation goes back to structural stability and morphogenesis and laws of form, wherein it was revealed that if you summate parentheses, the inside versus outside of parentheses, you can create the entire calculus. So whether it's inside versus outside is basically a summation of membrane theory, and membrane theory is a summation of how many sine waves are phase locked coherently on one standing wave soap bubble surface, which is why you can define the membrane health of your cell by doing a spectrum analysis, because it determines what music is holding the cell membrane together as a musical soap bubble. That's structural stability and morphogenesis and laws of form in one sentence. So, how does that lead us to this idea of sphere versus hypersphere? Because you see where I want to go with this is understanding the science. And I do mean wave science by what we mean by, well, are you 5D yet? And have you gone to the next dimension? And have you transcended or ascended yet? And supposing you're an electrical engineer and you wish to discuss those things and actually understand instead of being woo-woo, then this becomes very applicable and grounded and actually something you can use in practice. So what is meant in that case by going to the next dimension or going from a sphere to a hypersphere is the ability to rotate into the next axis of superposed symmetry of rotating charge, something we've said many times before. But let's try to say that another way. Ultimately in physics, there is no such thing as a sphere or a hypersphere. The only thing that there is in physics is waves made of charge. There's nothing else, which is another way of saying there's only an electric field. Physics is nothing except electric fields. And the extent to which an electric field is spherical is the extent to which its inertia is isolated. Its charge is not distributed, and hence cancer. This doesn't mean that spheres are evil, but it means that nature uses spheres only for certain very limited applications, like your eyeball, for example. But other than that, your cells will generally not be spherical because they want to be charge distributive and not charge isolated. So, now let's try to make a more sort of a chemical analysis of this. Let's suppose that we're talking about, let's see, let me bring my face back here, click on FaceTime again, here we go, okay. And we're talking about going to the next dimension in terms of chemistry. So here's your chemistry teacher talking, and we wanted to give a practical example here. So your chemistry teacher said, the whole atomic table is made of electron shells, and nucleus, protons and electrons, obviously. And your chemistry teacher says, all the major shells of the electrons that make up the whole atomic table are comprised of the same interdigitated nested layerings of the same subshells in the same sequence. They're called S, P, D, and F subshells. Now, your chemistry teacher drills into you by rote, the S suborbital has 2 electrons, and the pi suborbital has 6 electrons, the D and F 10, 14, and that's what you need to remember. But your chemistry teacher never, ever told you the shape. And unfortunately, if he told you the shape, then you could have visualized it. You could become psychokinetic and you could have enacted something in your lucid dreaming. But no, he didn't tell you the shape. Well, here's the shape. This is from occult chemistry, Leadbeater-Besant on the left here of the S suborbital, which is basically a teardrop. But now on the right, here's the latest from subatomic quantum physics, what an S suborbital looks like. It's a donut with two teardrops on either side. So if your chemistry teacher would have said, instead of S suborbital, if he'd have said the donut orbital, you would have actually learned something, and you would have been able to visualize what he's talking about. And the reason that the S suborbital has 2 electrons, obviously, is because there's 2 vortexes present in a donut. It ain't complicated. And similarly, the pi suborbital, a 6th vortex, is actually tetracubic. So here is the original psi perception of quarks, Leadbeater-Besant occult chemistry picture right here. And here on the right is the latest in modern physics view of the pi suborbital. Guess what? Simple tetracube. So if your chemistry teacher had said the cubic orbital or tetracubic orbital instead of the pi suborbital, you'd have actually had a handle on what's happening to those waves called electrons. Now, this is where we get toward our lesson here in going to the next dimension. So now we move up to the next suborbital, the D and F suborbitals. The D suborbital here is pictured here. Basically, it's radiating spokes or teardrops radiating out in dodeca and then F suborbital ecosa symmetry. Obviously, we're leading to how dodeca and ecosa nest in each other infinitely, as D and F suborbitals do nest one inside the other in a stack or an array or Chinese dolls nested fractally to make the layering that completes itself with, for example, the gold and the platinum group metals, which are implosive and phase conjugate and negentropic. So that's where we're going with this. So, point being here for our conversation, the relationship between that pi suborbital, that tetracube, and that D and F suborbital, the D and F suborbital 10, 14 electrons, 5, 7 vortex pair. What are their 5-7 vortex pair in? Well, obviously, if you look at the symmetry axes possible in the dodecahedron, of course, the dodecahedron has 10 faces. Would that be 5 vortex? Well, actually, it has 12 faces, but axes of symmetry, vortex pairs. So the number of vortex pairs possible are 5 and 7, which is 10 and 14 electrons. More specifically, I give you the example of Armand Weiler's advanced work on the 7 axes of spin in the icosahedron. He called it 5 real axes and 2 pseudo axes of rotation. Basically, number of axes of spin of charge superposed. That's what going to the next dimension is. And so when you embed, as you did, that tetra cube, which in here, I don't know if you can see it in here. Let me see if we get it in this picture. I'm playing with the camera here. You can almost see the green cube in the very center. Well, the angle at which that green cube is embedded in the white balls of that inner dodecahedron, that tilt angle of that cube in that dodecahedron is 32 degrees, the classic chin angle of the Sphinx story. That's how you went to the next dimension. That's how the cube becomes a hypercube, and that's how the sphere becomes a hypersphere. It literally, by nesting it in a higher order of spin, you tilted the cube up 30 degrees, spin it, blink 5 times, and you have pentadodeca. You went to the next dimension. Well, what that meant was there is a longer wave of charge whose axis of charge rotation superposed in that spin enables that embeddability. It's more than Playboy, embeddability. It's the ability to embed a longer wave, that perfect nesting, perfect embedding. And obviously the ratio of that wave edge of that cube to that dodecahedron is 0.618, golden ratio. Hence, you got to conjugate, you got to implode, you got centripetal. The tetracube, infinite stellation of tetracube, has no center. It's the opposite of fractal because it's opposite of compressible, contrary to what Nassim says. And because the adding and multiplying the square root of 2 ratios of tetracube symmetry called the octave is the opposite of compressibility and therefore the opposite of fractal. So you didn't get to the fractality and therefore the conjugation and therefore the implosion and therefore the negentropy until you rotated into that golden ratio based dodeca, that next dimension, that hypersphere, which enabled charge distribution. So that was an example of how to take that to go into the next dimension. Now we want to use this conversation to introduce something we've talked about many times. Let me see if I can get this in our little PowerPoint here. So this conversation wants to lead into how we plasma project biphase conjugation into longitudinal waves for the same physics, that when that golden ratio series of cascades, which is enabled by the dodeca hypersphere, dodeca ecosa, geometry of Earth grid DNA, zodiac, and Gold's valence electrons, and alchemy, and implosion, and negentropy, all the important stuff based on golden ratio and fractality and conjugation, which creates the implosive negentropy, precisely the Planck threshold, and that's my equation. So the slide we've been using to teach about that, if I may, here in this window of the longitudinal keynote, as we presented recently in the Amsterdam Energy Conference. Here it is. Okay. Talked about this many times. Just a short review. So we're about to try to use what we just said, what we just talked about, to explain the physics of not just going to the next dimension, but what really is ascension and what really is transcendence and what really is the rapture. Like, if you read the Left Behind from the Religious Fundamentals, they're quite sure that during the rapture, guns will melt. Now, I'm here to explain to you the electrical engineering of why this is correct, among other things. And I'm here to explain to you why the extraterrestrials are so concerned about what's happening with respect to quote-unquote 5D and the pressures on the Earth right now having to do with the moon. And to introduce that, we need to review this slide in front of us right here. So this is from the longitudinal keynote we've used in all the latest lectures. If you look at almost all of my most recent lectures in our famous, if I may say, YouTube channel, fractalfield.com YouTube channel, this is the key slide. So basically what's happening is, as these waves, when they get into this golden ratio embeddability and these vortexes get to the correct angle, which happens to be 60 degrees here, the angle of the cone of embedding the dodecahedron, that the wave that travels down that cone, that vortex, that pine cone, as a golden spiral on that cone, the side view is a caduceus, as you see here, all based on golden ratio, and the vorticity is translated, translation of vorticity perfected, defines golden ratio in hydrodynamic physics, and what is translated specifically is the up and down inertia, which is called the transverse wave of electromagnetics, which is the only way we use electromagnetic fields for everything that communications and military does on this planet, because they don't basically know what a longitudinal wave is, even though it was Tom Bearden's life and the basis of all negentropy and Prairie and Therapy. So longitudinal waves are important, even though conventional physics would have you ignore them, and even though the military would say it's a top secret military weapon to even talk about them, except it's how your mind and your spirit works, so maybe it's important. So anyway, so conventional physics uses only the up and down motion of the slinky of the transverse wave, and that inertia, which is going up and down, is modulated to produce communications and energy and all the stuff we do with conventional physics of electromagnetic field theory. However, if that inertia of the transverse wave field effect enters a corrected vortex based on golden ratio called phase conjugation, translation of vorticity, precisely tuned to the Planck threshold, the Planck length and time, by my original equation entitled Origin of Biologic Negentropy, where you take that Planck length and time and multiply by integer exact exponents of golden ratio 1.618033989. You get all this cool stuff: 3 radii of hydrogen, Earth year, Venus year, galactic year, precessional year, and all the important stuff, the adenosine diphosphate, and the list goes on and on and on. So you get how to tune the heart, you get how to tune the brain waves, you get how to tune the Earth to produce this translation of vorticity, to produce longitudinal wave embedding, incorrectly sometimes called torsional and scalar, as we've said many times. So what happens is, when that inertia goes down that cone accurately, the inertia entered that spiral on the cone going up and down. But as it goes down the cone, if the cone is accurate, called phase conjugation to Planck, then the inertia, which was transverse, comes out the other end, squeezed through the toothpaste tube, accurately to that Planck threshold, which is the only 0 point of 0 point energy, the only still point of every conversation in spirituality and transcendence and philosophy. The only 0 point that ever existed is precisely Planck. That is the 0 point. There is no other 0 point. Sorry. There is no other 0 in physics. That's 0 for physics, is Planck length and time. So that threshold, by agreement for a million light years in all directions from here, all waves seem to have agreed for some particular reason on this Planck dimension. And what happens is, at that dimension, that agreement produced a galactic radio of longitudinal waves, sometimes called gravity waves, sometimes called the collective unconscious, sometimes called the rapture. No, we're getting ahead of ourselves. So if you really understand what's coming out the other end of that toothpaste tube, you understand suddenly it's orderly with respect to the compressional component of that wave, called longitudinal electromagnetics. And when you interfere that in an orderly way at a distance, you get the only real physics of action at a distance, meaning plasma containment and heat containment for all fusion physics reactions, meaning the way, as we said, Ingo Swann heated that thermistor with his mind at a distance through a Faraday cage repeatedly in the laboratory, etc., etc. And all this mysterious, quote-unquote, spiritual conversations about people who affected things at a distance. And the reason that Therapy works at a distance almost all the time, if you understand how to do it, it's simple physics, is these longitudinal waves interact, but they interact in a very disciplined way, requiring a grid dynamic. So this means that, first of all, this is what we call the rapture. It is what we call transcendence. It's what we call going to the next dimension. It's what we call getting 5D. It's orderly distribution in the longitudinal array grid. It's specifically and exactly what is meant by the dream spell and the song line and the dreaming tracks and Aboriginal. You see these Aboriginal shamans sitting on these song lines, which we now know are these longitudinal arrays, and their eyes are closed and they're manipulating waves at a distance down this grid, and they're making the rain. Hello, Australia. Let's learn the physics. So the ability to embed in this longitudinal array, for example, determines whether or not you can lucid dream, and therefore whether or not you will take memory when you die. And this is a simple, and I repeat, simple electrical engineering problem. We know the people who have died and come back, they said, lattice, cobweb, tunnel, spiral. We know the geometries you see when you die, and now we know the physics of why you see that, because it's implosive compression. We know why Raymond Moody reported all the surgeons are clear that the death visions are electrically contagious, because successful death is a precise phase, conjugate implosive black hole. And when Danny Schreiber died, bless him, he came back and told his lucid dreaming partner, thank you, Fiona, that he heard, not only did he see that, but during successful death, I think he had a successful death, he heard the audio heterodynes produced. So it's like the deep rolling thunder, the ringing in your ear you hear, because your DNA is doing that implosion, because that's the only way to get into that longitudinal grid array, sometimes called the collective unconscious, the communion of saints, and DNA radio. It's all about embedding coherently in that longitudinal array. So this then brings us back to the other conversation about what does that longitudinal array look like, and just for a review, which is really almost unnecessary here, but just some of the pictures. So what does that longitudinal array look like? Okay, so here, let me see if we have some of these pictures. So this is dodecaecosa array, originally from the Star Mother, but then if you see, this is the dodecaecosa array of the original Earth grid, anti-gravity in the world grid, the famous, and remember all the TV specials showing that why did every sacred site, pyramid complex, etc., on the planet exist in this dodecaecosa array right here. Why? What's the physics? Because that's the only place that the longitudinal compressional array grid can propagate efficiently. That's why on that grid, where the speed of light divided evenly into the wave diameters of the Earth from Bruce Cathy's harmonic 33, where he measured on that grid, which what we now know is the longitudinal wave array, which we now know is the physics of gravity waves, that Bruce Cathy repeatedly measured, there was a dramatic effect on nuclear half-life and radioactive critical mass. Is that a threat to national security to know that? Well, it also happens to be the only way to die well, so maybe it shouldn't be a threat to national security to know how to die well. Okay, this is how the radio works. Every sacred ancient burial ground was located on the grid. The ancients understood this perfectly well. So, now there's the next part of this conversation introduces the extraterrestrial context in this to remember, humans are childish, of course, in not recognizing their relationship to extraterrestrial politics, and this will come very soon to threaten their survival. They must recognize their relationship to extraterrestrial politics. And so we're going to gently try to introduce that component in this conversation here. And with that in mind, I'm going to introduce a bit of a dialogue we had recently. I'm not just shifting gears here, I'm widening the picture to see how understanding what we've just talked about helps us understand our position with respect to extraterrestrial politics, and therefore the actual long-term possibilities of the human race. So, our friend, Med, we shall call her Mediator, she's wonderful. We've been working with her for a long time. I'd like to show you her website here now. I'm very glad she has gone more public. Here it is. Mediator Medias. I repeat, mediatormedias.wordpress.com, Med's website. She is the original contact to the Tegatan Pleiadians, who only after did Gosha and others make very famous on their very famous YouTube channel, Cosmic Agency. But the actual original contact is Med, the mediator. And so I'm going to introduce just a fragment of a correspondence to try to suggest some context, but I'm suggesting we look at Med's website. So Med has been very sort of family related to the Tegatan Pleiadians. Remember now, the Tegatan Pleiadians is the family from whom Enki and Enlil arrived, and that's quite clear. Every ancient culture on the planet pretty much says Pleiadians, that's where they came from. So, and remember, the Tegatan Pleiadians, and Med will confirm that this is a very difficult, very extremely female-dominated culture. And this film will then be at the top of our discussion of what this means in the context of ET Politics, the famous article where we assemble all our ET information fractalfield.com/fusionintheblood. That's where we put all this information. And part of that context here is our long-term study of Anton Parks's work, who confirms that indeed the Pleiadians were extremely matriarchal. And we learned that it's critical to understand that if you want to know every religion on this planet starts with fear of women. That's how I began to study the extraterrestrial politics, because I was trying to figure out where the fear of women came from on this planet. Well, guess what? The Pleiadians, that's where the fear of women came from on this planet. And if I may say, from my experience of conversations with Ned and others, that the female-dominated Pleiadian culture, unfortunately, at a certain level of emotional maturity, but happened to have the biggest guns in the local. But that's not really what this conversation is about. But Med, fortunately, has been also much more very conversant with the Andromedans. And I, as you may know, I knew Alex Collier fairly well in my years in Denver, Boulder, and encountered through him what I call the Andromedan mystics, Morine and Visayas. In later years, recently, actually, I had some personal telepathic contact with Visayas, who we learned later, also with Med's help. Visayas was, in fact, one of the military leaders of the Andromedans, even though, in fact, while the Andromedan ships were huge and their major craft wedge-shaped on the other side of the moon, we understand, which is where many of the Pleiadian crafts originally were harbored, even the Tegatans. The Andromedans were extremely spiritually mature and functioned as mediators in battle, but really seldom were involved at a military level themselves. But the Andromedans are important to understand a big picture here, because they are kind of some of the senior galactic core cultures in my view. But the particular part of the conversation, and I'm sorry if I jumped ahead a bit there, but there's a particular part of this conversation that relates directly to what we've just been discussing, and it's here. So this is from a note that I was just writing to my friend Ned, whom I'm grateful to, saying that we have been discussing for a long time, quote, letting Earth become 5D, this is their language, happens as the frequency generators in the moon fail. Of course, on the surface, that statement would have no meaning to conventional scientists unless we had some measurements. Now, I'm going to give examples of that. So remember, this story has been repeated many times from many sources, and obviously there must be some truth to it, including from Med, that frequency generators in the moon create a bit of quarantine here. Now, Med has given us a lot more detail on that, but there are many sources. And basically, we all know probably that the NASA seismic data pretty much proved the moon was hollow and metal. That's old news. And the moon is probably, if you believe most of the myths, most of what Star Wars called the Death Star. Well, what did they mean by that? Well, according to this part of galactic history, and we're in the process of learning more details, was that the early galactic cultures, when they realized that the interventionist and at that time largely parasitic Draco and their progeny, the Kingu. So the Draco, you think of a dragon, that's what the Fusion in the Blood article is about, fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. The Draco were called Ages of Uras, U-R-A-S, which became our word Uru, as in Uru Asa Elen. That means ancient dragon or Draco blood. And the Draco bloodline was the powerful one in our galactic sector, and unfortunately did not have much respect for humans. We were snack food and slaves. And we will continue to be snack food and slaves until we start to understand some of this physics, and that's why we're here. So the Kingu, who then became the largely parasitic reptilian inhabitants of the central Earth, and there were millions of them until just recent months, and supposedly Tegatan Pleiadians were in fact instrumental in reducing the parasitic Kingu population in the inside of this planet from millions to tens of thousands only. And we're supposedly to thank the Tegatan Pleiadians for that. Although we now understand that the higher Draco, called the Alpha Draco, which are much larger, actually have come to recognize the importance of respecting the freedom of indigenous peoples like primitive humans, And so the Alpha Draco helped to remove some of those Kingu mirrors. But now we understand that the Andromedans invited the feminine-dominated Tayghat and Pleiadians to leave, and mostly have, because although they had the big guns, if I may say, they did not have the emotional maturity. But this is only a story of context, and you shouldn't believe any of this until you've checked out many things for yourself. But I give you one example we've spoken of many times, but I suggest you do check it out. When you hear Jason Rice on Gaia TV, now remember, I don't believe some of the other, but Jason Rice, he has been through the lie detectors and the polygraphs and all the good stuff, and the psychological tests. And Jason Rice is clear, went to South America, projected on the moon, and the Nazis, with their Vimana, Nazi Bell, had in fact propagated Earth's worst humans to Mars and Ceres elsewhere, because we didn't understand propulsion, because we didn't understand how to make a sphere, a hypersphere, and make it plasma projective, which is exactly what the Mercury vortex called Vimana and Nazi Bell is. And that's the advanced propulsion science, and that's what we talked about in that fractalfield.com/vacuum energy conference I presented at in Amsterdam recently. But the conversation here, I really want to finish this thread, was could we actually measure what it means to become 5D and therefore survive the rapture? So remember, when they said during the rapture guns will melt, what they meant was, the physics is that a low dielectric constant material like the metal from which you make guns, which during charge compression will experience heat. So we've talked about this before. The physics is exemplified by the implosive hydrogen torch called Brown's gas or Joe cell. That hydrogen gas, sometimes called water gas, that gas will beautifully burn and melt steel, but it won't burn or melt your hand. The reason is dielectric constant. The steel resists implosive compression and therefore generates heat. That's why guns will melt during the rapture, whereas your hand will not. So this is what they call rapture or transcendence as 5D, is being able to experience the plasma spin density and therefore charge distribution unpacked beautifully of this implosive compression called phase conjugation to Planck. And to understand what the ETs meant by preventing portals from opening on the Earth, and thus preventing, in effect, how the rapture is modulated, we were told, and this is Med's conversation, that there were, at the ancient times when they realized that these Draco and Kingu had holed themselves up on Earth in the solar system, they planted these nuclear-powered frequency generators in this hollow metal Death Star moon, which prevented the portals from working and therefore isolated the locals. Remember, if you're an advanced extraterrestrial, obviously traveling through the speed of light is only possible if you phase conjugate by golden ratio through Planck into longitudinal coherent propagation, which is the physics of how stargates and portals work, one of which is named Uru, Asa, LM. Uru, Draco, Asa, Queen, L, place of the transcendence or phase shift, and that's otherwise known as Jerusalem. So the ability of these implosive plasma projective stargates to work depended upon this harmonic series, this cascade. And you all know that Jerusalem is so beautifully sitting on this power point, this dodecaecosa longitudinal embedding plasma projective possible because of longitudinal coherence. The same reason in physics of why the famous Kozyrev mirrors only produce military quality transcendence or military quality telepathy if you put on these nodes, which is why every ancient cathedral and sacred burial site and stone circle and labyrinth were always placed on these longitudinal magnetic lines, which is why, that Therify plasma works beautifully at a distance in many of our centers, but it works better if both the sender and receiver are placed on these magnetic line crosspoint nodes where there's this implosive dimpling, which plasma projects into coherence, embedding this longitudinal grid array, which is where the radio of the rapture works. For the same reason that action at a distance works better, and Therify works better, and Agnihotra works better at sunrise or sunset, and at equinox, or rather solstice, at solstice, because of the right angle physics of four-wave mixing, which enables phase conjugation. So remember, you're sitting there and they're lighting the plasma flame of the Agnihotra, and your hair stands up only at precisely the second of sunrise or sunset, the only time when the green flash is possible, because the longitudinal array becomes available to you only at that precise moment, just like the lasers had to be angstrom accurate right angle four-wave mixing in order to phase conjugate and produce measured negentropy and time reversal, which is the first time negentropy and time reversal was ever measured in physics. So these right angles are very important to this. Lining yourself up to embed in this longitudinal propagation, and therefore where you have access to this longitudinal array and access to the rapture. And from this node or array, you can die successfully, lucid dream successfully, and any aboriginal worth his salt knows you got to find where the long song lines cross. So, what was the conversation? We understand, measure how implosive frequency signatures enable charge collapse. In other words, we now know what the frequency series is. There's 8 hertz, and there's 30 hertz, and there's 50 hertz. These are the frequencies that made Antoine Priori work. These are the frequencies that make Therify work, and they learn from Lakhovsky and Tesla. And because these are precisely golden ratio multiples of Planck, which I discovered, and that's how we perfected Therify. So, embedding in longitudinal EMF, and therefore this business of being able to get into 5D, actually is measurable. So, we've talked about this in many international lectures, fractalfield.com/conjugate mind, how this longitudinal array actually is the business of actually unpacking your mind. Because when you close your eyes and you see this wave picture crystallizing in the liquid crystal optical electromagnetic hologram that is your mind, the implosive center point is the conjugate point called conjugate mind, which is why your brainwaves do best at golden ratio, called flameinmind.com. The physics of bliss. And therefore, the light begins to crystallize. You remember, it's very, if you can make alpha, then when you close your eyes, you see the light. If you can't make alpha, then when you close your eyes, you see the dark. That's why beer drinkers drink beer, is to make the alpha so that they see the light. Turn the lights on. So the ability, and this is because that alpha is actually Schumann, and the Schumann is golden ratio to Planck, which is phase conjugate implosive. That's how Gaia is negentropic. So we wanted to finish this conversation, or try to finish this conversation, by giving you a measurement example. And so I'm speculating that these frequency generators in the moon, which, by the way, now MED says clearly they're breaking down the obsolete nuclear tech which was used to power these frequency generators in the moon, is breaking and can't be fixed. And more than half of them already died, and they're dying quickly. And that means that the Earth will then be subjected to much more of this implosive compression, formerly called the rapture or the photon cloud, whatever you call it. It's actually simply a symmetric compression that you must either compress successfully or experience heat. In other words, go to heaven or hell. Quite literally. I mean, quite literally. So, so MED and others have said, and I'm sure they're correct, that as this experience of compression, the rapture, there will be more earthquakes and volcanoes, of course. And people who are relaxed and able to do this compression, which is the same skill it takes to lucid dream or die well, they will become clairvoyant. And they will hear their inner voices. They will hear their ancestors. You know why? You know why you hear the ancestors? They all come out of their graves during the rapture? Well, that's pretty simple physics. All these plasma cocoons suddenly get longitudinally embedded in the array, and they can then propagate again. They're no longer trapped. Do you know why Therify plasma is so famous for releasing ghosts? For the same reason, implosive plasma compression. So Therify is a small bit of rapture physics, a little localized rapture physics. Now, if you place the Therify at the longitudinal cross points, and use even longer waves, then you get a little bigger piece of the rapture. And Therify plasma is famous, and I do mean famous, among shamans, like Kate Forbes in South Africa, who talks extensively about it in the therify.net/blog. It's famous for accessing shamanic portals. So now we know what a portal is. And even Bill, very famously, well, described. You know, if you line up these phase conjugate arrays, the send and receive point accurately, that's exactly, and I mean the physics of how the ancients set up the portals to propagate from here through the heart of the sun and to the heart of Andromeda, which is where that stargate goes. So we know the physics of how to set up the electromagnetic send and receive at these phase conjugate points, which is the actual physics, and I do mean physics of the movie Stargate. You know, that was the actual Wolfenum-Enochian alphabet, back to Terry Burns, that was used to make the movie Stargate, because that's how these plasma portals work, by setting up this hypercube dodecaecosa plasma grid array to make this implosion and propagation into the longitudinal possible. And you go down these longitudinal wormholes in this dodeca called the movie Contact. Hello, Jodie Foster. So now you're getting a clue why, if you prevent these critical frequencies from propagating, you can shut the stargates and portals and prevent the Earth from imploding, which these ancient frequency generators, the frequency fence, the frequency quarantine, was supposedly doing per these many, many reports. Now you say, well, this sounds a little speculative to you. Fair enough. Okay, where's a measurement? Well, okay, we're going to do a measurement right now. So here is our breakthrough technology, flameinmind.com/lifeforce. We simply take our famous brainwave sensor, we measure a microvolt, and we spectrum analyze. We're using the Muse wireless transmitter, which we use for the brainwave analysis, but we use it also to measure life force in trees and life force in the grid here. Flameinmind.com. And the life force component there, if you click on /lifeforce, I wanted to show you some examples. So here we're measuring the harmonic content of bamboo sacred architecture. And you see this harmonic cascade here, beautiful, and the Schumann harmonics show up. So you can predict in advance which building will cause a seed to grow, hint bamboo, and therefore which architect deserves a paycheck. Whereas the steel and aluminum building will prevent these harmonics, will prevent seeds from growing and your children from having a soul. Therefore, that architect does not deserve a paycheck. And it's measurable. That's our global curriculum, which is becoming famous, goldenmean.info/architecture. Well, it goes beyond that. So here, what we're showing is, in the various sacred spaces, we've done this now repeatedly around the world, and we must credit Patrick Botte, B-O-T-T-E, my co-inventor for flameinmind.com, from Belgium, who's made a lot of these beautiful measurements and programmed all 6 or 7 of our new biofeedback apps, okay? And the new ones are plasmafire.com, Real Heart, plasmapHIRE.com, 5vibes.com, realheartcoherence.com, flameinmind.com. I mean, we're just going to town on these powerful, powerful biofeedback apps. You can teach love and empathy and tantra by measurement. It's really fun. And the psychokinesis of these implosion harmonics now in vibrators on your spine and in plasma balls of various types, quantify, plasma fire, therify, is beautiful. It's all the same harmonic recipe, my equation. Anyway, so we're measuring these sacred spaces around the world. We've been wandering around, and here it is. We have cows in a magic field, very fertile area, and the cows are in the field. These ladies are outstanding in their field. The cows are in the field. And what do we measure? Oh, here's this 53 hertz harmonic peak. Here it is there, here it is there. Here is a biologic dome. This is a wooden sacred dome structure. And here's this powerful harmonic at 53 hertz. And here is Patrick went to Sam Osmanagich Bosnian pyramid, very famous and great friend of ours, is wonderful. And he's measured the infrasound and related it directly to the rejuvenation effect that millions of people come there to get rejuvenation, the same way they come to Therify to get rejuvenation, because phase conjugate charge implosion is negentropic. So here we're measuring the Bosnian pyramids, thanks to Patrick Botte. And again, 53 hertz. Why are we getting 53 hertz on all these places? So we went back to our homework, scratched our heads, and here's this conversation here about that. It says, you know, Dan Winter's equation predicts that if you take Planck and exactly multiply by golden ratio, you should get 50 hertz. And true enough, 50 hertz was central to Prairie and central to Therify, and is the most mentioned frequency in all the medical literature on what heals cancer. Yes, 50 hertz with the publications, therify.net/blog. So 50 hertz is pretty cool. And by the way, if you got that 50 hertz, you could make carbon nano grow to the 99% pure. That will change every industry on this planet. Thank you, Carl. And if you try to do it in 60 hertz, sorry, USA, your carbon nano ain't gonna grow. What's the problem? Tesla got that a little wrong. Oops. So 50 hertz is precisely, it was 49.99 something, the golden ratio to Planck, whereas 60 hertz does not implode, therefore does not get negentropic, therefore prevents your children and your seeds from growing. Hello. So then we asked this simple question. We said, well, how come we're measuring 53 hertz when we should be measuring 50? And so we went down the charts and we said, oh, well, the actual calculation, that's right here in blue, I don't know if you can see it in the small print. The calculated frequency of what the Schumann resonance should be from my equation, 7.29 hertz, 11.8, 19.09 hertz. However, the measured Schumann harmonics, well-published, well-known, well-established, very common, very standard, and by the way, Greg Braden, they're not changing. No, the cascade is increasing in harmonic inclusiveness, but they're not increasing in frequency. Wrong. It's the harmonic inclusiveness that's changing. So anyway, the actual Schumann frequency measured is 7.83 hertz, 14 and 20.8. So it's close to the of the theoretical, but not accurate. Now, if you take the 7.83 measured Schumann harmonic and keep multiplying that by golden ratio, you know what you get? 53 hertz. Hello! The difference between the real Schumann and the correct Schumann, 7.29 versus 7.83 hertz, is exactly the ratio between 50 and 53 hertz, which are exactly golden ratio exponents times. So, the Earth grid is almost implosive, almost transcendence, almost ready for the rapture, but the Earth grid could get tuned a little bit. Remember when Lovelock wrote the Gaia hypothesis and he proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, Earth grid is self-organizing. Temperature, pressure, ability to maintain life. Obviously, Earth is self-organizing. Why? It's because it's negentropic. Well, why is Earth negentropic? Because of the Schumann harmonics. Why are they because phase conjugation of Planck. So why, when you make those same frequencies in your brain waves, do you get transcendence and the rapture and bliss? So this is all tunable, and so we actually have our ET context now in the process of confirming, and we thank Med and others, whether or not these frequency generators in the moon are actually involved in this 50 versus 53 mystery. So we are very close by measurement to proving how external oscillators control whether or not the Earth grid is negentropic implosive and whether the stargates work, and whether we and our children have access to the rapture. Now, all of this conversation has a practical implication, which is that as you locate your meditation, your birth and your death and your prayer and your therapy and your plasma and your altar and your cathedral and your labyrinth, where to put them, or your cozy rev mirror, you need to be able to douse very simple field of magnetic lines, because that's the blood of the Earth, that's the longitudinal electromagnetic coherence grid, and that's the bloodstream of the collective unconscious. So if you embed and distribute your aura in that, you can wake up with a larger body called Hey Ave, where the breath of charge takes flight, heaven, or the planes of Charon, etc., etc. Planes of Charon, we know, is the physics of the hyperextended electrical orbitals of the phase conjugate materials of gold nano, etc., as Lawrence Gardner discussed from David Hudson. So all of this conversation leads us to a real physics of, instead of New Age woo-woo saying, well, are you 4D yet, or are you 5D? Have you done the transcendence? Are you transcendent? Have you had your rapture experience today? Have you gotten 5D? No, it means whether your aura has been accurately tuned to phase conjugate and implode, and that's tunable in brain waves and heart rate variability and in the Earth grid, and this frequency signature can be measured and taught with biofeedback. Now, the psychological component of that is, when you get this harmonic cascade accurate in your brainwaves, flameandmind.com, what is the first thing you do? You cry for a month, as I did, for every unshareable thought you ever had, because that is how you embed in that grid, is because that charge of distribution says You know, you can't die well if you're angry because these waves are not shareable. They cannot embed in charge distribution perfection. So the ability to sort your emotions and prepare for bliss or death is the same physics. And that's what this frequency signature of the charge implosion really means, because there's increased spin density down there and increased awareness down there, but there's only one mind there. Thank you very much.